my little Prezi just to make sure it all gets in here. Okay, so just to talk today a little bit, someone needs to mute the microphone. We want to talk about how Canada is affected by international trade, and just to sort of understand, even sometimes older students still use these words interchangeably, just to understand that when we're the difference between importing and exporting. So it's just like kind of immigration is anything coming into our country. Uh, I am the same sort of prefix as anything that's brought into our country. So anything that we bring into Canada, usually it's consumer goods. There's a lot of stuff that you might purchase yourself. There's a lot of automobiles that come in. There's some food that comes from other parts of the world. Anything that's brought into Canada would be an import. And then anything that leaves the country to go somewhere else, we have a lot of oil, a lot of energy uh, products that would be exported. And just in terms of, if you think of it like surpluses, if we have extra wheat, if we have extra agricultural products, if we have extra lumber, exporting to another country to make up for a shortfall in another area would be a big benefit of trade. So sometimes you hear somebody like Trump maybe talking about losing money on trade or having a trade deficit. So one thing that countries do is they try to calculate their, what they would call their balance of trade. That is, if they took their exports minus the imports, did they make money or lose money? Did they export slightly more than they imported in total, or vice versa? And right now, if you were to look at this graph here, that's Canada's balance of trade. We have a trade deficit of about 1.5 billion. Starting off, in the 90s, Canada did export more to other parts of the world, but as we started getting more consumer goods from parts of the world like Asia, where we were signing free trade agreements, it started to decrease. And although it fluctuates, right now we lose a little bit now. So that is money that's leaving the country. That's jobs that's leaving the country. That might be a factory or a farm that closes. But then again, if you look around your house, how many labels come from other countries? That's a bit of the trade-off there. And so, if a country exports more than they import, we would say that they have, second, letting someone in. If a country imports more than they import, they have a trade surplus. So that means, they're selling extra goods. For example, Canada, we might be, not now, but we would be selling more oil than we took in consumer goods. We would be, selling more agricultural products. Perhaps some of the mining that we did in Northern Ontario and Northern Quebec, we're selling more of those products than we're bringing in. And so that means exports are flowing out, and, money to hire people, money to build factories, to build facilities flow in. If a country imports more than they export, that is, if they're bringing in more goods than go out, they have a trade deficit. And it means that that's Canadians' money. That's, you and your family's money is leaving Canada to purchase the goods, that are coming from overseas, that are coming from another country. So you hear, it's definitely one of Donald Trump's trade, talking points is that the U.S. Has a trade deficit. What he tends to do is he overstates it slightly, because he does count up the goods that they get from China. They get a lot of, consumer goods from China, but then he doesn't count the services, the banking, the consulting, the other, the business services that are sent to China. So he tends to overstate the deficit that the U.S. has with China, meaning that, yes, overall, the U.S. exports more, the US imports more from China than it sends out, but he doesn't include services, which are, we often think, okay, well, a car crosses the border, that's an export. When someone goes overseas to work, that is also, something that's they're exporting their services. So these trade deficits include goods and services. I'm not going to show you the videos. You can rewatch the videos on your own time if you need. So sometimes what ends up happening is, well, there's too many imports, and as a result, the people lose their jobs. Uh, you don't have enough production um, capacity locally. And one thing that they'll do is to put something you might hear of a tariff. You might have heard of Donald Trump putting tariffs on Chinese goods, which is like a tax, right? So if you go to the store and you pay a 13% HST tax, that's going to the government. Um, this would be like you're a business, you go and buy, aluminum that's coming from another country, and you pay an extra 15 or 20% to the government as a tariff. So sometimes what countries will do to shrink that trade deficit is they'll put a tariff on goods. So, there was one of the products that had a tariff on it was ketchup that was made in Canada and then was sent to the U.S. As part of reducing their imports, the U.S. did put some tariffs on things. So although we are signing more and more free trade agreements to eliminate those kinds of barriers, that still happens. Every now and then that there'll be a good that there is a tariff or a tax on. So sometimes, understand that, so we talked about you get a great access to markets. So if you've maxed out your sales in Canada, a great way to get access to 10 times as many customers is to go to the United States. To get access to more customers is to go around the world. So, you can import your products, um, but there could be risks. You sometimes when you launch in another country, it doesn't actually succeed. I don't know if you recall, Target tried to launch in Canada because it was close to the US border. It didn't quite work out. Tim Hortons has tried to expand into the US and it hasn't quite worked out. So sometimes international business does fail. Sometimes ways to avoid that is to research how people are interested beforehand, to get good partners, to learn about the other culture, to make sure the product will fit, and to make sure the goods are of a good quality. So there's a couple of terms on the handout. Sometimes you might have noticed in Canada when you go to buy something, there might be times where you directly buy it from the person who made it. Like if you go to a local clothing store and you buy something that a local, business owner has made, you're directly purchasing it from them. Or you might notice you go to a bigger chain, you go to a chain and you find that there's, these, Hudson's Bay, you can go there and you can see all these other brands that have been shipped there. So you're not directly buying it from, say, Nike, you're buying it from Hudson's Bay. They have indirectly purchased it for you from Nike, so they're kind of like an intermediary. The same thing might happen with imports and exports. You might have a product that directly goes from the manufacturer to you, for example, cars. They don't change ownership. There's no third party. The car company makes it in Mexico and ships it to the dealership in Canada. That could be directly exporting it. Or sometimes something like, a commodity, right? You don't directly, if you were to buy tomatoes, you wouldn't directly go to a tomato farmer in Florida. It would go through a couple of wholesalers, and then you would go to the grocery store and get it that way. So something like an agricultural product would be indirectly exported. I often feel like I rush through some of these things, and I don't want to miss any questions because I feel like sometimes I'm really going through the terminology quickly. If there is any, questions, if you click on participants, there's a raise hand button that appears in the side menu, and you should be able to stop me if you have any questions. So to understand little bit about the effect of how Canada, our leading trading partners, the United States, because of our close proximity, we have a very, very similar culture. The transportation network is totally connected. Not right now because only essential travel is going through the border, but you can go along a highway, from the 401 straight into the US, and you can do that at many parts in the border. Initially there was a 1988 free trade agreement. So there was an election last spring, right, between the Conservatives and the Liberals. Back in 1988, the main issue for that same kind of federal election was, should Canada have a free trade agreement with the United States? The idea was, well, this will open it up to more, we'll get more goods, things will become cheaper, our companies will be able to do business in the United States. But then there were concerns that it might, harm our economy, it might harm the amount of jobs. Then in 1993, the agreement was updated to include NAFTA, to include Mexico. And since that agreement, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed with Mexico in 93, the economy of the three countries has just absolutely grown. It really has helped with a lot of trade. However, if you look at the employment figures, some manufacturing jobs are leaving Canada, are leaving the United States because they can get a lower wage in Mexico. So that's been torn up. NAFTA has been torn up, and there's a replacement deal, the US Mexico Canada agreement, which is being ratified at the moment and should be similar to NAFTA, but with some protections. And that was sort of just a revision of the deal. So, but overall, it has been good for our economy. We've been able to purchase a lot more. People have made parts of their goods in the US or Mexico, brought them to Canada for assembly. It has, overall, if we look at the economy, it has gone up. So Canada, here are some of the countries that we trade with. Firstly would be the US, then China, a lot of consumer goods coming from there, the UK, Japan, Mexico, and India and South Korea are rounding out the group. And if you look at that, it's mostly places that have similar cultures because of the same preferences, like the US, like Canada. Although on the other hand, we do have companies there like China where there are differences just because of the low cost of production of goods in China. So it makes for a very, very cheap product that wouldn't be otherwise available in Canada. And when we're buying lots of clothes or we're buying lots of electronics, we want something that's very inexpensive. Sometimes, you might hear the term free trade agreement. That's an agreement between countries to reduce the amount of tariffs, to make it easier to flow. Like there's sometimes a quota, meaning, oh, you can only import 200 million from this country, or, oh, this product's not allowed because of a regulation, or there's a 20% tariff. To reduce some of those trade barriers, free trade agreements are signed. And so Canada has been signing a lot of those over the past few years. Here's some of the recent trade agreements that have been signed. And, as you can see, it was sort of one by one, like one country at a time. But then recently, we signed a big one called the CETA, the Canadian-European Trade Agreement, the Comprehensive European Trade Agreement, that really opened up Canada to a lot of the UK and Europe countries. So if Brexit is, formally happens, once the economy gets going again, we'll have to figure out, do we have a separate agreement to facilitate trade with the UK, or are they somehow counted in that old agreement? That's one of the details that'll be figured out. So sometimes, you know, businesses and workers are not thrilled with free trade. Although sort of the economists, the government would say that it's great to have free trade, there's been instances where people are not happy. This clip, I don't know, you might not recall this, about 10 years ago when they were having a G20 meeting of the top 20 countries in the world in Toronto. So many people were upset about, having so much interconnectedness in the global economy. There were big riots in Toronto that lasted a few days. Lots of people were arrested. A couple of cop cars were burned on Queen Street. So not everyone's happy. Reasons that people would be against international trade is, well, that local Canadian producer. So if you knew someone, in Kensington Market who was making clothing, they're now at risk because the market's being flooded by fast fashion companies owned by transnational companies from overseas, and it can hurt local businesses. Sometimes people who've been working, as in manufacturing, producing goods in Canada, they find that the wages in Canada are too high, and those factories go overseas. And if we want to think about what's happening with COVID-19, the US and Canada are having trouble producing some of the protective equipment and some of the tests that are needed. So once that production capacity leaves the country, then you lose control of it. So we have sold some of our pharmaceutical companies to international companies. So now we don't have control of all of our sort of drugs and chemicals. Or we're buying, protective equipment from China or the United States, which normally works fine, but now that there's a bit of a shortage, those countries are keeping those goods in their own borders, and we don't totally have, control over it. And sometimes, the people are worried that individual cultures are going to be lost. That we're all, we all sort of have this consumer culture. Sort of, instead of having unique countries and unique cultures around the world, that it can become a little homogenized. So those would be the cons to international trade. The pro would be we get more goods than we ever could before. We get cheaper goods. We have access to the materials and agricultural products from around the world. But the con can be that jobs are lost, that small businesses are hurt, and we do lose a bit of control over what our economy can produce. So that's what I wanted to sort of end with, that there are people in the world who are against trade. So you have to think, hey, do I want to be pro free trade? I like having all my extra goods. I think that people have the right to sell anything across the world, that if people want to work in Europe in the financial services, they should be allowed to. Or do you think, what, it's sensible to have some kind of precaution or some kind of balance between the two? Sort of after sort of that sort of really quick outline, are there any questions or concerns? And you can stay in afterwards if you do. So I posted, we're still giving out, projects, right? And sort of the project for this month, and I'm flexible about the deadline. I better share my screen so everyone can see. I'm flexible about the deadline, but I set it as next week, is to sort of create a bit of an international product launch. So to sort of evaluate your application and your critical thinking, for you to pick a Canadian company and suggest for an appropriate place for it to expand, and then also to detail how that expansion would happen. So here's one example of how it could be done. If we're just talking about something local, like Swiss Chalet, you know, not a major company, but a sort of a Canadian company. It's it's you know, you could start off by describing it. You know, so if you didn't know, Swiss Chalet initially started in 1954 in Toronto. It operates 200 locations in Canada, and it's now called Recipe Unlimited, which includes Harvey's, the Keg, and a bunch of other restaurants. So when we're talking about Swiss Chalet, we're actually talking about the company Recipe Unlimited. It did start off with one location in Toronto, and now it's a big Canada-wide chain. So you could say, I think that this company would do well overseas. And you would then want to, you know, say why. Well, you know, because of recent trade agreements with the European Union, it would be good to go to Europe. So that could be a good point that includes some of the content from today's class. You saw that list of countries that Canada has a free trade agreement. A good logical first step would be to go to a place with free trade, right? There won't be any barriers or limits or too much paperwork. So, but then you want to also have specific points. So here, like the population of Europe has remained steady, but fast food and lower cost food has risen in popularity. So that's good because Swiss Chalet is low cost. And if you want a specific stat, Swiss Chalet serves chicken. So you can look up how much each country in the world consumes in chicken. And if you were to look at Europe, the per capita chicken consumption has gone up 17%. So they've de-emphasized meat and consuming 17% more chicken. So you could talk about, you know, similar countries to Canada. So again, I looked at that website that had the chicken statistics. Well, 28 kilograms per person per year in the UK, 30 in Ireland, 23 in France. Although it is true that Spain and Portugal are up there, their recipes are sort of a little different, and they're quite different than what Swiss Chalet offers. So that could be a barrier, you know, people having different preferences for different kinds of dishes. So the recommendation might be don't go to Spain and Portugal right away because the recipes are very different. So you could talk about their slogan, you know, family happens at Swiss Chalet is their slogan. And you can talk about where other, like, you know, look at demographics. I've on the project tab, I've included a Google slide about where you can get some statistics. So talking about number of families, talking about prices, talking about the relative income level. If the income level is the same as Canada, it's possible that they might succeed. So, you know, here's some of their price points. So what would be a barrier to that? Well, there's actually some limits on how much livestock you can ship from Canada to the US because European farmers are a bit protective. So you might have to find some local, just a second, you might have to find some local partners. Was that trying to get better at using, oh, okay, so the question was, is this what's due on Friday? No, this is the bigger project. It's called International Product Launch. It is, it's due at the end of the month. It's if I go back to the classroom, again, I want to always have you doing something little each week. So this is due Friday, and doing what's due on Friday is just to find one article. And then I've even put some of the articles here so you could see how the current events are affecting trade. What this is referring to is the international product launch. Again, I'm flexible on the deadline. I think I had said it, before all of this happened for April 27th. I might revise it, but for those of you who need to improve your business mark, this would be a good way to make a bigger improvement. Or for those of you who feel comfortable about your business mark, at least you can go through the exercise of what would you do if you were the CEO of this company. And so again, one of the barriers, one of the issues that could happen is you just can't ship a bunch of chickens to Europe. So also the transportation is complicated. So finding local partners, local farmers would be a good step for Swiss Chalet. Again, we're not sure what's going to happen with Brexit. It hasn't been formalized. So although Canada produces the chicken and potatoes for Swiss Chalet, locally sourcing it for France and the UK. So local sourcing would be a good term you could use if you're talking about making something locally. That would save costs. And just the idea, maybe Swiss Chalet isn't the best name. Maybe the name of the company isn't the best, and you want to propose a change. I'm going to get to that question in a second. So again, talking about, look at the climate, right? Canada Goose doesn't sell winter coats all over the world. They sell different styles of coats depending on the weather. So this is sort of saying, hey, maybe let's stay out of the south of France and focus on launching at the north of France. So what would be a good strategy? Okay, let's say remove the name Swiss so no one feels confused. Let's say finding those local partners. And it turns out that, French employees, especially in international business, one of the issues that has come up is when a North American manager goes to run an office in France, they tend to be poorly received. What research has shown, it's actually better for a local person to be trained to be the manager. So as a result of that research, one of the recommendations for launching this company overseas is to locally train managers who can manage, rather than having a foreign manager, have local managers. Expanding the menu and including some dishes that would be appropriate. For example, like a chicken curry, which is very popular in the UK. So modifying the menu and to launch in urban areas. So that would be how you could take a company like Swiss Chalet. You could discuss, what does Swiss Chalet sell? Who do they sell it to? Which country would be suitable? Well, one that has the same income level, one that has a lot of families, one that eats a lot of chicken. What would be some of the issues? Well, how are we going to get all that food there? What are we, who's going to manage the restaurant? And then describing in detail how you would launch it. Okay, let's modify the menu items. Let's focus on a budget, price point. Let's launch in the north of France. Let's launch in cities. Recommendations like that. So you could do it in a written document, or you could do it in a slideshow if you wanted to. Can we take up the fill in the blanks from today's handout? Yeah, so I think I'm good for today. What I would like you to do is, at least go into those closets and see, where are some of the labels, just to be aware of what is coming from your, in your life. Do you have electronics from South Korea? Do you have something that was, made in another country? And go and look at that research. Hey, go to one of those sites and just see how the COVID-19 news story has affected trading, and we can take that up again on Thursday. And if you want to stay and go over the fill in the blanks, I'll do that now, so you can head out if you're good. If you want to go through the vocabulary in the handout, you can stay in the chat. So thanks, and I'm going to get that worksheet up on the screen now. So how do you want me to just sort of tell you what the answers are? Did you want to call them out? So if we're, even though it might not be across the ocean, offshore can be used interchangeably with overseas, just to mean a different country. So if you're moving it offshore, you can move it to Mexico, even though it hasn't crossed an ocean. It's just sort of a way of saying, so a lot of companies, they offshore their manufacturing by moving it to a place with lower production costs. Taxes placed on imported products would be a tariff. So a tariff is just like a 15, 20, 25%, depends on what the number is, tax placed on, and sometimes you can call them customs duties. So if you hear in the news, oh, Canada's put a custom duty on US lumber, it's the same as a tariff. So a company that operates in several countries would be a transnational one. And a pro of doing this is if you have factories all over the world, an environmental issue or a shortage in one part of the world or a labor issue in one part of the world won't disrupt your operations. This one's from last class. A product that's standardized across many countries is a global product. So something that you would get, like an Apple product, a Coke product, usually one of those big names, Nike, Air Jordan shoes, those are sort of the same product. It's recognizable all over the world, is known as a global product. Referring to our own country, would we just use the term domestic? So balance of trade is our exports minus our imports. And if we have more imports than we have exports, we have a trade deficit. If we have more exports than imports, we have a surplus. When it goes through a middle person, it's indirect. So for example, the farmer sells their tomatoes to a wholesaler. The grocery store buys it from the wholesaler. Your family goes and buys the tomatoes, at Metro. That's indirect exporting because it's gone through several steps. We're talking about how it can hurt jobs, it can hurt culture, it can make people feel like they're not in control of their own situation. So the hidden costs of trade are the social costs. Free trade agreement is to reduce the amount of paperwork and tariffs and increase the flow of goods. When a country exports more than it imports, it's a surplus. What are some of our other terms here? Okay, so when you might hear that a company's outsourced their IT department. So, and when you call, say, Rogers, you get someone in another country. And outsourcing can be done within a country. For example, you could outsource it to you could outsource your IT to a local Canadian company that's just more of an expert in IT, or you could outsource it to another part of the world where things are totally cheaper. And I'll make sure I use the right words so that I'm not confusing anyone. International can be used interchangeably with foreign in our trade discussion. And when the exporter deals directly to the consumer without any kind of, for example, one of those big brands like Nike, it's going to go from the Nike factory to the Nike store, and you go into the Nike store and you buy it there, or a car, that's made in a plant in Mexico, and then you buy it in Canada. It hasn't gone through any intermediaries. So that would be sort of the matching the definition. Do you have to hand in this sheet? No. But then going forward, like then you have your notes for when you take international business in grade 12, and you've already remembered what these words are. So I did it in fill in the blank style, just as a way to change it up. Sometimes if we give you the whole notes, no one writes anything down, but I believe if you do have to write it down, it helps you remember. Did you want to go through those sentences, or did you want to sort of leave those sentences to do on your own to just help you study? I mean, yeah, there's not going to be any more. There's no more tests this year, so I would have said, oh, well, these would be the words to know for your test, but now they're just the words you need to know to better understand the news and to be ready for grade 12 business. Do you guys want me to do those sentences, or do you think you're good on your own? You want to try and maybe if you wanted to guess to call the word out, or put it in the chat window, like if you go and buy a donut at Tim Hortons, it's an example of a what kind of transaction. What word do you think would go in there? You know what I'm going to do? I think you guys could improve your participation by 5 or 10%. I'm going to leave those sentences the way they are. So if you go to the classroom now, you'll see, you'll see the answers here. And then I've left it blank. So you should be able to take each of these words, and now that you know the definition, take each of these words and sort of fill in the sentence. So if you're at home and you want to do that, just go to File, make a copy, and then you can save it. And that'll just help you remember the terminology. If you already remember the terminology, then you don't have to do anything. So barring that, if you have any questions about the international product launch, let me know. Otherwise, our next class is Thursday at 10 a.m. And I encourage you to go maybe do a little bit of a research. I've posted some sites in the classroom. How has COVID-19 affected trade? Maybe you already know. Maybe you've already made some observations and you've noticed, oh, some things are a shortage, or this has happened, or so on. Maybe you don't even have to do the research, and you could write a short comment just on your own. But if not, go and do a little research about how COVID-19 has affected trade. And I guess I don't have anything else to add, and I'll see you on Thursday at 10. Thank you, everyone. Mhm. Mhm.